Man in the nature reserve. This happened just this weekend, and I realized it was the first time I've really felt creeped out by a situation or a person. Now, with that being said, some friends and I were sitting around a cafe drinking coffee. Around 9 p.m., we decided we were bored and to do something different, besides loiter behind the cafe smoking an unhealthy amount of cigarettes. We thought it would be a great idea to walk around a cemetery, so we did just that, but found it just as boring as sitting behind the cafe. It wasn't as spooky as we hoped for. One of my friends mentions the forest near where we lived that is known to be haunted, so we decide to go. Ironically, of course, we really weren't in the mindset to deal with what we experienced, so we head out to the area in separate cars and regroup in a parking lot in the small town that the forest is located in, and proceed in a single car. We drive down this dark winding road, guided only by my friend's memory, and we never really find the place we are looking for. We feel disappointed for driving a good half hour to get there, and not really getting to experience a haunted forest. So, we decide to stop at a nature reserve trailhead that was listed online, so we get to at least experience something out of the trip. As it is about 10:30 p.m. at this point, the ramp down to the parking lot is closed, so we park in front of the gate and just walk around it. We head down the ramp and comment on how many stars we can see. Once we get to the bottom, there is a dirt parking lot and an information building that is closed. The only light coming from the building is a deep red light. Why they would use red light bulbs is beyond me, but it kind of put us in a weird state of mind. We could hear running water, but we didn't dare venture down the trail to check it out. We walked up to the building and checked it out. Nothing too interesting. We walked around it, and nothing interesting again. At that point, we decide to leave. As we are walking away, we hear rustling coming from the bushes, so we turn around and it stops. This really reaffirms our decision to leave, and we start walking again. Then, the rustling starts again, and we turn around. That's when we notice a beam of light shining on the ground from the bushes. It's a flashlight. That's when a man steps out of the bushes and directs the flashlight at us. He appears to be moving it back and forth, looking us over. The interaction goes as follows. "Holy shit, man, you really scared us." The man doesn't say anything for what seemed to be an unusual amount of time. "What are you kids doing down here?" "We were just looking around." The man doesn't speak for, again, what seemed to be an unusual amount of time, constantly keeping the light in our eyes. "Well, we were just, this area is closed." That's when the man starts slowly approaching us. I'm really too creeped out to speak at this point. "Hey man, don't come any closer." The stranger stops. "I'm a police officer." From what I could see myself, the man did not seem to be wearing a uniform of any kind, not even a ranger uniform. He seemed to be wearing jeans and a long-sleeve shirt. "Where's your car?" "It's by the gate." That's when I knew something was wrong. There was no car by the gate, let alone a police cruiser. The man also came from the bushes on the opposite side of where the gate was. I mouthed at my friends the word, "Run," and we did just that. We booked it up the ramp and jumped in the car and locked it. We immediately started the car and reversed and peeled out onto the road. Just after getting back onto the road, we passed an old beat-up car sitting perpendicular to the road. Immediately, the car lights turned on and it pulled out onto the road behind us. It would get really close and then pull away and flash its lights, and it was honking like crazy. We went faster and faster, but it kept up the whole time. Once the small town came into sight, the car just stopped completely right in the middle of the road, and we watched as it got smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. I'm still really unsure what happened, Maybe it was just a person trying to scare us. But I'm not sure if I really want to know what he was up to if that wasn't his intention. Conspiracy creep. I was in the middle of a turbulent second year at my university in Wisconsin. To the north of us is a university-owned nature reserve, which I enjoyed walking around in. One day, I was getting some photos when I noticed a man coming up the trail. I hate for this to be one of those "he seemed normal at first" stories, but that's exactly what happened. We began to talk about the beauty of nature, and he said he was simply out enjoying the evening air. Then, he started to talk about his supposed animal magnetism. The way he described it, his life was practically a Disney film, with woodland creatures flocking to him given the chance. I didn't point out that there weren't any around us now. He'd have probably come up with some excuse like, "Well, you're scaring them off." The conversation continued, and he went into more detail about how much better he was at being a human being than most people. He claimed that people talk differently, unconsciously, to everyone they meet, but he had risen above that and could present himself up front and honestly, whether he was talking to a businessman or a child of the ghettos. He then introduced me to the theories of David Icke, those conspiracy theories that the world is ruled by a secret race of lizard people. That's the guy who started it, and this guy believed it completely. One specific thing I remember is that his accusation that George W. Bush held secret blood rituals at Camp David. This was back when Bush was in his final year of presidency. It was at this point I tried to get away from him, politely of course, but he would not take a hint. Our conversation had gone on for so long, the sun had almost completely set, so we had moved out of the park back onto campus. At the very least, and I do mean least, I was careful enough to be walking around areas where there were a lot of people and also made damn sure not to lead him right to my dorm. Finally, after requesting me to look up the works of David Icke, he left. I took the long way home after that, just to make sure I wasn't being followed. Some years later, I was shopping at the local grocery store when a man happened to pass by me. I don't have definitive proof that it was the same guy, but only someone as off his rocker as he could have said the following to me without any further lead up. "You look familiar. I want to kiss you, but I don't know why." I laughed it off, but the longer I shopped there, the more nervous I got. I didn't run into him again, but as I drove out, I saw him wandering aimlessly in the parking lot. It took a while for me to realize I was going to be okay, even after I had gone home. I brought it up amongst my friends the next day, and they were more than familiar with the guy. So, conspiracy creep, let's not meet again. Satanism, or a bonfire gone bad. The year was 1989. I was 7 years old, and my mother had served divorce papers to my father earlier in the month. Their relationship was an insane and mutually abusive experience, and tensions were high all around. During one particularly heated incident, I grabbed my mother's keys and purse and hurriedly ushered my younger brother outside to wait in the car for our escape. We watched the sunset as we waited. Moments later, my mother rushed to the car and jumped into the driver's seat. My father was 2 steps behind her, yelling and cursing as he reached the car window. She revved the engine up and squealed away from him in a haze of burnt rubber. Our trip was not a long one that night. Eventually, We drove to a nearby lake on the edge of town. We had been there many times before, as it was close to our house, and my mother found the cool rushing of the waves to be a comfort. It was her favorite place of respite. We parked on the far edge of the lake, and she turned the car off and rolled down all the windows. We sat in silence as the Oklahoma wind ripped across the lake, finding solace in the rhythmic crashing of the water. She cried, and my brother and I eyed each other helplessly. Suddenly, a woman cried out in the darkness. Every hair on my arms raised in answer, and my mother's head raised sharply. She looked to the back seat where my brother and I were and assured that it was just teenagers fooling around. She said that she was going to have a look, just to be sure. My brother and I begged her not to go, but she is an incredibly stubborn woman and told us to roll up the windows, lock the doors, and not let anyone but her inside. My brother and I watched in horror as she passed the front of the headlights and walked into a grove of trees to our right. We pressed our faces against the glass, trying to see her through the shadows. Suddenly, she came tearing back through the trees. I moved quickly to unlock her door and she jumped in. Breathless, she started the car with shaking hands and sped away, heading to the nearest exit from the lake area. She refused to tell us what she had seen, but said that we were going home and were to immediately get in our pajamas and brush our teeth. Eventually, 15 minutes after we arrived home, my brother and I were discussing the event in whispers in our shared bedroom. There was a knock on the door, and I peeked around the corner in the hallway to see that 2 law enforcement officers had arrived. At that moment, I rushed back into my room to tell my brother just as my mother came to our door, told us to stay inside our room, and closed the door behind her. During those days, I was a sneaky and precautious child, and made my brother swear to be silent as I carefully pried the door open to listen. I quietly tiptoed into the hallway, and I heard it. I heard my mother recount to the officers the crazy scene she had witnessed at that moment. This is what she said. So, on the other side of the trees, she had seen a group of individuals in dark robes around a small fire that were speaking some strange language. She saw a young woman there, dressed in street clothes, who was ultimately restrained by 2 of the hooded figures. They asked for more details, but she told them how she had been afraid for her life and herself and her children and knew that she had to get to a phone to call the police. Eventually, the officers left shortly after, and I quietly crept quickly back into my bedroom. My mother came in and tucked us in, and my brother and I ended up staying awake that night after I divulged the details with him. I don't know what the officers found down at the lake, or what became of the investigation. My mother still refuses to speak of that night to this day. What I do know is that in the 80s, there was a large satanic presence in Oklahoma, and a lot of creepy stuff happening. Also, this lake was at the south end of what is known locally as 5 Mile Road. You guys can search it up, which is rumored to have been where many odd rituals took place, and where a lot of weird things have happened. They found mutilated animal remains, and even bodies at the nature reserve that is on the edge of the lake. That whole place has bad juju, and even now, it is one of the eeriest places, even in daylight. Chainsaw Man. My grandparents lived on a small farm in rural America. Though the farm itself is quite small, we own much of the surrounding land, and so I spent a lot of my summers cutting apart downed trees and burying roadkill from the roads that border the property. I'm not a particularly small girl. I'm 5'9", and even though I'm on the slender side, I can quite easily move a killed deer or chop a tree to pieces. Much of my grandparents' property is deep woods. It's not connected to a major road or even a service path, and is only bordered by other farms. There are two exceptions to this, however: the small north-south running main road, where the house sits, and the side road, which is an out-of-service fire road, used by firemen to access the mountains behind us in a case of a fire. As far as I know, no one lives up there, and the only time we ever use it is because it's a semi-clear, cropless, and floraless path that winds from the far west side of the main road to the barn, and so it's convenient to drag down trees along when we're taking them to be chopped for firewood. You can barely see the house from the side road. The only real way to see it is to be in the barn itself. So, my grandparents start working every day around 6 p.m. to start preparing dinner, and I usually help. But one summer day, a few years ago, around 2012, we had had a thunderstorm the previous day, and more were on the way, so I was determined to move all the downed trees back to the trunk pile. It was around 7-ish, so still bright outside, but as it was late summer, it was beginning to get a little on the dimmer side, and I knew I did not have a lot of time to finish up my chores and get back to the house. I was finally old enough that I was allowed to use my grandparents' chainsaw to take apart the trees on my own. Before, I had been limited to dragging the branches and to splitting the trunks with an axe, but I relished the privilege of, well, sawing things into pieces. My grandfather had been working with me earlier that day to take apart trees though, so I hadn't been using it all that much because he was much more quick and efficient with it. So to recap, my grandfather and grandmother are in their house. It's late afternoon and evening, not a soul in sight, and I'm alone on a semi-abandoned road, pulling 100-ish pounds of trees back to the barn. As I was pulling the main trunk of the tree along the dirt road, I had a neck-prickling feeling that you sometimes get in the woods, that there is another human or animal around. Now, our property's woods line up pretty well with another farm's woods, and those farmers had kids around my age, so it wasn't unheard of to see them tromping around in our woods, especially during hunting season. But as I said before, it was summertime, which is nowhere near deer season or any other animal season. As a matter of fact, I'd seen coyotes and the occasional bear in the woods, which is why we frequently carried firearms if moving around at night. But bears aren't usually out during the daytime, and coyotes were usually wary of coming near our land anytime even close to the day because of our big black dog named Mountain eating the scraps from the food my grandma was cooking. So I was a bit nervous. I knew that if any animal came at me too quickly, I'd be totally screwed, because while I could pull a tree trunk at walk pace, there was no way in hell I could run with one of those, and it was strapped across my chest pretty tightly. Still, I picked up the pace, thinking to myself that it would be my last drag of the day, and I would go inside soon. I came around the corner to the barn, quickly unhooked the chains from my chest, and rolled a log into the pile of its fellows. As I turned around, immediately behind me, standing barely 10 feet away, was a young man, in his 30s I'm guessing, holding my chainsaw, which was covered in reddish sawdust, and watching me. Nothing really seemed off to me about this guy, other than that he was on our land uninvited. He was dressed like a camper, with hiking boots, duffel bag, and a baseball cap and shades, And since we're fairly near a nature reserve, it didn't seem completely impossible that this guy had gone lost and wandered onto our land. Like I said, there was a fire road leading up into the mountains that I had just dragged a log for half a mile on. Conceivably, he could have walked down on it. He said that his name was Alan, and he had seen me when he was hiking from the hill behind and above me, and had seen that I had left my chainsaw behind me. He had waited a while to see if I was going to come back, but after 15 minutes of watching the sky darken, he had decided to return it, so it wouldn't be out in the coming storm. I was quite pleased. It was my first time. My grandfather had let me finish up a tree clearing on my own, and I would have been seriously embarrassed if I left his tools out to rust or vanish in a mudslide. Alan asked me where he was and whose land this was, and cheerfully offered to help me stack up the rest of the logs and pull a tarp over them so that the rain didn't bother them as we talked. I, being friendly and quite relieved to be done with my work for the day, chatted about my grandparents and our land, and mentioned that they were both inside the house, pointing up the hill and across the fields to the white house in the distance, making dinner, and that I'd have to head back soon if I wanted to get home before dark. He seemed quite sad about that, and said he was lost and needed to get pointed back towards the trail, and I was more than happy to show him the way back, since I no longer had my load. He had saved my ass by returning the chainsaw, but because our personal paths through the woods are quite twisty. Just as we were finishing up, we heard a loud bang from the barn, and Alan looked really nervous. I laughed, trying to reassure him, seeing that my grandfather was probably still inside the barn and had dropped something. I turned to look at the barn, trying to see him inside, and my grandfather came out from the barn, calling to me, before he saw me standing there. He then came over to me, scolding me for staying out so close to dark. I apologized, explaining that I wanted to finish up and had almost forgotten the chainsaw, but a nice hiker had brought it along for me and dropped it off, at which point I turned to gesture to Alan, who was gone. My grandfather came up beside me and looked at me with a funny look on his face. He asked me why I didn't remember that he brought the chainsaw back to the barn with him, instructing me to finish carrying the logs back before the rain came. He told me that since there had been flash floods the night before and were scheduled for this upcoming night, that no park ranger of the local park would have let hikers into the area because of how unsafe it was. We turned to look at the place that Alan had been, and at the duffel bag and chainsaw, both of which had been left behind. Upon inspection, the chainsaw was indeed not ours. It was the same brand but far older, and the reddish flakes around the blades were definitely not sawdust. I prayed at the time that it was animal blood, since I do know that some people use chainsaws to take apart dead, rotten deer before burial, or to make them more easily scavenged by local animals. But in light of what was inside of his duffel bag, it seemed unlikely. There wasn't anything inside the bag that you need for camping. Instead, inside his duffel bag was a tarp, several trash bags rolled tightly together, duct tape, condoms, zip ties, and a collapsible shovel. My grandfather took the duffel bag to the trash lot the next day, and we both decided that A, I would never be allowed out of sight of the house again without a rifle, and B, we would never breathe a word of this to my over-anxious grandmother. So, Alan, let's not meet.